Welcome to Longevity Industries' presentation of the Destiny of Manufacturing podcast. I'm your host, Dean Phillips. I would like to thank our sponsors, localenterprise.com. That's enterprise with a Z. They provide robots that sanitize, clean around areas, and take temperatures and do all that sort of thing. CodyBot is one of the products that they supply. And our time of COVID, it's very necessary. So look into them. And of course, the Precision Metal Forming Association and the PMA's Educational Foundation. We appreciate all the great work that they do. I would like to thank Spinar for providing our next guest. Kevin, are you there, sir?
Dean, I'm here, loud and clear.
Well, sir, thank you so much for being here. Of course, Spinar America, our guest is Kevin Weafer, and he is the CEO and president, of course, of Spinar America. So, sir, tell me right off the bat, what is your biggest takeaway?
Wow, a great question, Dean. And if I could take the liberty, I would like to start with a slightly different point, a preamble, if I may. And that is that each of our listeners has been through extremely real-time, extraordinary, challenging experience over the past year. Basically, one day we turned off the lights and went home and had to make everything work like nothing happened. And they have demonstrated unbelievably remarkable innovation, determination, problem-solving, grit, guile, and prove that American industry can thrive under severe disruption and the most difficult circumstances. So I'd like to take this second just to say congratulations to everybody. Hats off.
Absolutely.
Back to your good question. Back to your good question. Here's what I see, both in tech and manufacturing, so both 5 years from now. So I think we'll become semi-cyborgs, combining organic and inorganic parts. Our brain will still control the elements, but we will simply be connected to more and more devices. Whether it's a bionic arm or direct-to-brain interfaces, we continue to outsource our mental, physical, and communicative capacities to computers and machinery. Technology will only continue to improve and get better and better. Then this thing called singularity happens, which, of course, your guests know a lot about, which is super intelligent, self-directed machines. And then a really interesting thing happens. Then we go from the standpoint of increasing to exponential as opposed to incremental. Right. The why of that, if I could offer just a little back end on it, is because I see technology as being ecological and even in some sense mythic, which means it changes, in now air quotes, everything and becomes part of the natural order of things. So 3, 5, 10, 20 years from now, technology will be highly pervasive in every aspect of our personal and manufacturing and engineering lives. And it will feel as if it is the natural order of life. So There's my opening thought.
I will tell you this, that is an impactful opening statement when you talk about the future of and the destiny of manufacturing. I think, and you can see steps in that direction already with things like exoskeletons and how we use those. It doesn't have to be yet to the point of actually being implemented in a bio way. It can still be currently anyways as in an external format, but you could see already through biomed where some of that is going. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. So
well, thanks. And you're right. It is incremental, right? In other words, it's sort of, and I don't mean this in the dark way, but it's sort of creeping along every day. A company takes on new technology as an important aspect of their leadership. And that element adds to the next step and the next step. So over time, it becomes highly pervasive.
Yeah.
And highly accelerated. I'm sorry, Dean. highly accelerated. I do believe that, sort of all tech to today, as crazy as this sounds, we're just in the first maybe foot of a football field.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to accelerate straight up from here in a highly rapid and amazing way.
Yeah. You just think about how computers are accelerating and how quickly they do.
Sure.
There's no question that as we get into more artificial intelligence, it will multiply very exponentially from there.
Exactly. There you go.
So tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get involved with Spinar, and what made you passionate about getting into technology?
Oh, such a great question, and thanks for asking. As you started, President and CEO of Spinar America, based here in Boston, my history is from the other side of the fence, if that's fair, which is I ran the Western Hemisphere for Time Magazine, and then became publisher of Variety, the entertainment title, and then have subsequently run businesses for two of the top venture capitalists in the world, specifically Sequoia and NEA, among sort of other assignments. And the way I say that is from the other side is that's highly content oriented, manufacturing in some sense, in terms of building something that we could distribute for user benefit and gain. Mm-hmm. And then more recently, I should say, I became president of a Japanese AR engine and platform that was based in London. And 5 years ago, I left there with some coincidence in between, I'll spare everybody, to build AR and VR solutions and importantly in today's market, platforms for Fortune 500 companies with Spinar. Just to allude, some of our partners are Lockheed Martin, Nestle, Time, Pepsi, Medicaid, the French aerospace company Zodiac, and InBev, Anheuser-Busch. And over the last 2 years, we've built what we think are really exciting and cool tools. One's called, I'll just walk through three of them, XPonnect, which is a pop-up expo conference platform. So we all now have pop-up stores in our local retail areas. Essentially, this is our version of that, to allow companies and corporations and associations to have a conference entirely digitally in fairly short order. In other words, not a 6-month undertaking, build and all of that. It's a plug-and-play sort of format. The second product is something called Thermalytics, and we're getting a lot of traction with this. It's a human temperature AI-based neural network for industry to address COVID. So if you picture a plant or a warehouse and a single entrance door, this product essentially examines every single employee in real time and their temperature. And as opposed to what is a fairly arduous process for 100 to 200 or 500 or more employees coming through a door at any given moment, this allows anybody with a temperature over what the marker is 101. They are taken out of line, and then a subsequent examination happens. So it's a product for today for sure, and certainly as we move through COVID and the pandemic. And the last product is Remote Vision, which is a distance learning, remote assistance, rapid knowledge capture, HUD platform, which allows somebody, an expert, let's say in Singapore, to talk with a field agent in St. Louis and see precisely what they're seeing through a set of glasses. We happen to partner with Epson and a headset that is called Maverio that they've built from scratch, which we really like, as opposed to a Frankenstein product that a lot of companies have done. But we are capable and have worked with all the other headset products, including HoloLens and sort of the entire group. So those are our three core platforms at this time. So I guess if I was to wrap this up, and thanks again for the question, Dean, we create world-class cutting-edge platforms and software for leading global companies.
That's phenomenal. That's a huge undertaking too. So my hat's off to you.
You said it. You said it. And in the tech and manufacturing market and industry at large, it's a huge undertaking because it is so fast, right? Tech that you build, part of our core offering to partners is future proofing.
Mm-hmm.
So something we build today has to be good for a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years if we're lucky, 5, depending upon hardware and a lot of variables that go into the mix. But the speed with which technology is changing makes our job a little bit more difficult, maybe is where I'm headed with that.
Oh, yeah. I I know what you mean. I know how technology changes and the platforms change so quickly. And we don't really even know how some of these systems will. You have to kind of jump ahead with companies like Microsoft and Apple and the computers that we're using, whether it's those or any other ones. Their platform changes and the language that they're using and things that they require. And as cybersecurity evolves, how we're going to adapt to that and to try and connect all those moving pieces, I can only imagine how difficult it is for you to keep up with.
It's dead right. And I guess if we're lucky, it's because we have a little bit of insight. We're invited often to hardware manufacturer offices and headquarters to see how they're looking at product. In HoloLens, since you mentioned that, or Microsoft and their headset product, their spatial dynamics, which is essentially put on a headset and it maps the room around you. I was going to say instantaneously, that's misleading, but it maps it well and reasonably quickly. But to the extent that that becomes real time, in other words, the room is mapped instantly, and then you can provide augmented reality, which is obviously overlaying the information on top of something else. That will be a significant platform step for the product. And it's en route. It's sort of coming along, but you're right. To stay ahead and to stay engaged in a timely manner is one of the challenges for sure.
If you were to look at some of the other technologies that are coming down the road, what are some of the ones that you're excited about that you think are impactful?
Yeah, I think that from the hardware standpoint, just let me sort of, we break AR and VR apart, which I think, some of the coding is comparable on the back end. But I think Oculus Quest 2 is solid hardware. And I know you're asking sort of the broader question about technologies in general, but just to address the hardware side for a sec. Sony's PlayStation, their VR product is quite good and very affordable at $320 or something like that. HTC Vive is a good VR product. So those three, I think, are leading the market right now in terms of penetration and quality from a VR standpoint. AR standpoint, I really do believe, and no surprise, that Microsoft and their product HoloLens is leading the market. It's the most advanced tool out there for sure. Not inexpensive, not that you would assume one way or the other, but it does have its liabilities. It's heavier. It's a little clunky at this stage. As computer processing gets more micro, it will become a better product, but they're sort of leading the market to do that. As I mentioned earlier, we love the Epson product because it is lightweight. It's very affordable, very available. There's a product called Vuzix, which is a publicly traded company, which we like a lot. One of the things about AR and headsets is, and one of the bigger choices that a manufacturer engineer would need to decide is monocular or binocular. In other words, the one eye screen or both eyes. We find greater satisfaction, to be honest, with binocular, the two-eye approach to the environment around the user. One eye, there's a little bit of a squinting of the other eye and sort of staring at a screen that's sort of immediately in front of you. So we think that there are some limitations to that. And yet, the Vuzix, that is a binocular product, is a terrific product and lots of capability. But that distinction, I think, is of importance. I think the other pieces now on the broader level and the software side, you commented on this earlier, AI, which we think of as highly advanced machine learning, right? Is I don't think this is even a word, but I think of it as consumptive, right? It's inching along towards some destiny of consequence. Just to allude to this, I gave a TED talk about this 4 years ago, talking about AI, and one of the comments I mentioned was Bill Gates back then said that we're going to have to ask AI how smart it is because we won't be able to tell. And this goes back to my opening comment of singularity. There's I was going to say an anecdote. There's a real story of some scientists that built some software that for two separate computers, and that for a discussion to happen between the two. And lo and behold, a few days later, a few weeks later, whenever it was, all of a sudden there's a third language in play, that they had developed their own language that the developers couldn't understand.
Right.
So imagine that on the highest level in terms of development and advancement and timing and compression and again, singularity. So I think, and that lends itself to IoT and IOE and sort of all the other acronyms that the audience knows.
Yeah, and those kinds of things, I think, are also back to the integration aspect of how we communicate from one form to another. That's one of the areas that I think is really exciting right now, is how do we get the information from whatever IoT format, whether it's a sensor or whatever type of 3D monitoring system or whatever it is, how do we get that from here to the other systems that we want it to understand? And it is a language issue in many ways, and how we communicate. And if we're in the same thing, if somebody's talking in millimeters and somebody's talking in inches, how do you convert that? And on the back end side, that's a very simplistic way, but
no, certainly. And it is one of the great challenges. You're so right. And then ultimately to infuse it into an organization and to try to make it organizational wide. And you had mentioned this word earlier, and we face this with Lockheed Martin, is the level of security that's required in order to do that kind of thing is of great consequence.
Yeah. Yes. And and it's a challenge that I think a lot of companies are going to be faced with for quite a bit of time to come right now with the way things are looking.
Certainly.
Tell me, when you look at the landscape of manufacturing, one of the things that excites me is you mentioned price point, talking about products. Well, that leads to the availability aspect. And if you look at things like 3D printing, how cheap some of the even baseline printing, so if somebody wants to learn baseline printing or things like getting into programming and learning aspects of Python and that, and getting into systems like Raspberry Pi, and the availability to, I consider that at the low end. When I started in computers, and computing was just starting out in the 80s, you're talking about still a huge investment, even unless you got into like some of the Sinclair computers, which I don't even know if anybody out there listening to this will even remember some of those with tactile buttons on them and things like that. But like Apple IIes and all of those, when they were starting off, they weren't very common in the average home. But a Raspberry Pi, you can get some of the simple Raspberry Pis for $10. Mm-hmm. What do you think that does for changing the landscape from a technology, STEM curriculums and things like that? Where do you think that helps us to move that line?
Wow, such a good question. I think that where my break is, I tend to think of things in thirds in general, in terms of audience in general. And in this case, to try to make that more clear, is I think there is an older generation of people, not to be an ageist in any way, because I would fit into this for sure, age-wise, that sort of are not in a position to see the benefit of technology in the way that other demographics will.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a middle group that are sort of working really hard, and industry leaders in this case, that are working really hard to, understand the value of what technology can mean, but also, as I mentioned earlier, imbuing it into their companies in divisions and in the hands of their colleagues and partners. And then there's a third group that maybe I'm headed with those two into this group, which is the digital native. Those people who have never not had a phone or
right.
have never not had access to the web and digital instantaneous understanding of almost anything they need to know. And I have tremendous hope. In fact, it's my great hope about the future that digital natives will adopt technologies. And we see it, frankly, in our business with Spinar that, when all of a sudden we find the person in the company that wants to grow $1 billion division, forgive me, but inevitably they're 38 years old, 42, young, focused, aggressive. They need technology in order to get their vision accomplished. And they're in a digital native and just comfortable with it in so many ways. So I think that there is an age component to this, not to hang my hat on that issue per se, but just to try to elucidate where growth and understanding and development might come from.
That's great. If you were to look at a couple other technologies that you see moving forward, what are some of the ones that get you excited? I've got a couple other things that I'd like to talk about in our very limited time here, but I'd just like to see a couple of your top view things of that you think are important in order to get to that future.
Absolutely. You alluded to 3D printing, which is sort of great consequence. We've seen that the rush of that over the last 5 years. It's just become a tool that people can employ in different manufacturing settings to allow for speed. The one issue with 3D printing is time consumption. Mm-hmm. In other words, it takes time for 3D printing to happen, and yet for prototypes and pilots, it can be really important. The other one is, and in fact, there's a company that thinking out loud here is robotics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a company based here in Boston. It's called Think Robotics, just to mention them as a name. We don't have a partnership with them, just to be clear about that. They have a product called Sawyer, and it's a lightweight human bot assistance tool. So the human plays a very important role, and essentially, if you think of it as a shoulder down to hand bionic arm, it's that kind of competency attached to a human. So I really like their approach to the market because it really feels like it's not jumping 3 years, 5 years or more down the road. It's right for today's market where there's transitional thinking and understanding and training required. So and for highly repetitious conveyor belt kind of activity, it's a great tool. So I think robotics will find their way into every aspect of our life. I have a really weird case study that it might be worth mentioning, and it's really about what I see is intimacy in warehouses and plants and industry in general. And the point of reference I use about it is your phone knows you better than your lover. So as we move forward, imagine a world where it's okay to hear from Alexa or Siri or any other NLP about your most personal matters, whether it's cancer, career upgrades, canker sores, name it. And here's the weird moment. Today there's a product called it's a smart toilet, right? So get this: it examines your deposit, recommends dietary changes, connects with your fridge, and orders the appropriate nutritional food from all digitally. Right, that whole process happens. So that's a weird piece of technology I never would have considered. But talk about functionality. I mean, that's about as functional as it gets, and less so on the manufacturing side for sure. But I think what it does talk to is the issue of how, and I guess my word, how intimate technology will continue to become as it aids in value and impact for manufacturers and engineers.
I think that's a great word to use for that, because I think we do that. There was a comedian who had mentioned that, and he says, you would never want people to see the words and the things that you have searched in a search engine, because you ask it questions that you wouldn't ask your closest friends.
It's a fact. It's absolutely a fact. Right.
Yeah.
True enough.
So, tell me, when you look at the new technologies that you just mentioned and the overarching aspect of it, what resistance do you see to these new technologies?
Yeah. I'd like to think of solutions in the face of resistance, as it were, as a point of view. So here's my thinking. I think, and I'll allude to a resistance point, but then try to offer the solution, or a thought on solution, is sort of creating a dynamic system / organization that is perpetually refreshable, right? In other words, it has its own capacity, as insane as this sounds, to stay current, to be fresh, to sort of real time. In Search of Excellence, which is a book from at least 25 or 30 years ago by Tom Peters, he mentioned there that it's no longer good enough to be comfortable with change. You need to learn to love change, love it. And if you don't, you're falling behind. And so I see the solution to that is cultural. It's a mindset, right? And that means sort of getting employee buy-in, developing some kind of cultural shift that thrives on change. The second thought I have is maybe is quantification of new technology. That is to say, there's no value without data. And one of the things that I know, because it's a relatively new industry, that is to say technology, is every single manufacturer or software developer like ourselves imbues data on the back end. In other words, we know that you can amortize a turbine, and you know it's a 10, 15, 20-year life cycle, and you know how to put that in your P&L. It's so much harder to do that with technology because, it's software. It feels amorphous. But so I think that manufacturers need to be able to quantify, and I think software and hardware manufacturers need to address that, and it can be done for sure. And I think the other challenge is maybe making focused outcomes and criteria. In other words, what do you need to accomplish? We ask that on every discussion in our business. In other words, what is your end goal? And then we, in most cases, can build software to address that. But to be clear about that from the manufacturing side, I think is invaluable. And the more clear, the better, so that there are no surprises along the way. And maybe the last thing, Dean, as I think about it, is security, right? As you alluded to earlier, globally and division to division, security is vital for competitive reasons as well as everything else that's going on in technology. So some resistance points with, I hope, some positive back end in the sense that I think that each one of them is addressable.
Yeah, and it's one area that it always concerns me about manufacturing is that manufacturers are usually slow to understand these problems until they rear their heads, and not as active as they need to be, especially on like things like cybersecurity and those sides of businesses, that they look at a piece of equipment that's 50 years old and say, okay, how do I go about making sure that this is going to continue to run, and what's the problem that's going to occur if it doesn't run. Same thing with communicating, and you've got computers in your facility that are 15 years old or they're 20 years old and are running Microsoft Vista or anything beyond that. It's a different world to try and explain to people that the security risk that goes along with having systems that are that old and adapting to it. As you mentioned, I think understanding and embracing it and saying, yes, we are going to move forward. We are going to do this, I think is a really tough challenge for a lot of companies. But the reality is there for them. They've got to understand where this is going to take them. And
for certain.
What?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, please continue your thought.
Well, very much so. And that 50-year-old piece of equipment, one of the super cool things that's now available is put on a headset, look at that piece of equipment. We've driven data into the headset, and you can visualize wear. For example, a particular washer that's sort of wearing out because it's been through 20,000 hours of effort. And we do a project with Nestle in one of their largest plants worldwide, where we happen to use the HoloLens product, and you can look at the equipment, and it's a tutorial so that you can sort of have in this case, it's a conveyor belt where they know they have very high efficacy of this particular product from stage 2 through completion. Stage 1, they have 90+% efficacy from 2 to the end. And stage 1, they're only at 68% efficacy. So we built the software and are using HoloLens to allow field agents to look at that aspect of the equipment to determine where the deficiencies are. Very successful program, and obviously they're gaining in terms of the efficacy of the equipment. So, and you're right on the back end, which is that data simply cannot be available to anybody but Nestle itself, right? And the team that's working on that. In other words, any Nestle competitor, it can't, it just all has to be sort of in a closed room, which essentially is how we build the software. But you're right, security certainly matters. Great.
What industries do you see that are successfully adopting this new technology?
Yeah, great question. The two for sure, and then two to some degree. I think automotive and medicine. One of the interesting anecdotes I know of is that 50% of all the robots being used in manufacturing in the auto industry today, which is amazing. Just thinking about consuming and accelerating their engagement. And medicine, there's just so much remarkable advances in surgery and also VR for training, right? When we now know that, for example, when an intern does an autopsy with a real body, there's obviously information captured and they understand the nature of the autopsy. There was a VR version of it created. We did not, but it was there. And there was a 40% higher retention with the digital version versus the real body. We actually did do a project with Medicaid, and it was for unconscious bias training for hospitals and clinics, where patients would come into a clinic or a hospital, and you would see a VR frame where a person is ignoring a 16-year-old person who is pregnant or whatever the conditions may be, and so literally putting the wearer of the VR in the position of the receptionist in a clinic to help them understand that bias can be an unconscious issue, and as a result, something that they need to be aware of. So as a training tool, it can be very effective. The other two industries that we see some take up and attention to technologies through is education, of course, and that goes back to the digital native piece in a sense. They have to talk to students differently today than they have in the past, and construction is also another industry where there are all kinds of hazardous circumstances where technology can sort of take over. There's a drone setup now that can put out a fire at 40 stories of a skyscraper and not jeopardize any firemen ladders or hook and ladders under those circumstances, because it's drone directed and AI software built. So those four industries, I think, seem to be leading right now. But a bunch of others sort of coming along and getting their arms around it.
That's fantastic. Tell people, as we get right at the end of our show here, unfortunately, how can people reach you?
Thank you for asking. Simple enough. I am Kevin at spinaramerica.com. So it's SPINAR America.com. Shoot me mail, and we pride ourselves on being diligent in follow-up. So if you have a question about anything we've talked about today or anything else, we'd welcome the question. And Dean, I can't thank you enough for this opportunity. It's been great to talk with you and the audience.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It has been my pleasure. It's been great to have you here. And again, this has been Longevity Industries' presentation of the Destiny of Manufacturing podcast. Go out and adapt to change.